Hello, very good evening. It's 8 minutes on LBC. You don't get many days like this in politics, or indeed even in the law, particularly in constitutional politics. We've always been very confident in our constitution in this country. Other countries look up to us for the way we conduct our affairs. And yet, I wonder whether that's going to remain the case after the events of the last few weeks. Not just today, it has to be said. The Supreme Court handed down their judgment at 10:30, 11-0, a unanimous verdict. They ruled that Boris Johnson had acted unlawfully. Now, for those of us that aren't lawyers, we think, well, what law did he actually break? And I'm not questioning the decision, by the way, of the justices. I think if it was sort of 7-4 or 6-5, I think we could have a real debate about the correctness of the decision. But I think you have to, whether you're a lawyer or not, you have to respect the fact that it was unanimous. And I'm not really going to have a lot of truck with anybody who says, oh, well, they're just 11 Remainer judges. If you are a judge, you leave your political views at the door of the court. That's how it should be. That's how it is in this country. And I'm not somebody who will go down that road. I think it is incredibly dangerous when people on any side of an argument think that there's a conspiracy against them led by the judiciary. I don't believe that at all. And I mean, if you want to come on the radio and have that out with me over the course of the next 2 hours, will be my guest. I think people tend to lose their heads in situations like this sometimes and immediately assume that this is all a plot. I don't believe it is a plot. I think we have to accept that the interpretation of the court is that Boris Johnson abused his powers. The interpretation that we have to draw is that he didn't tell the truth to the Queen. That's certainly the interpretation that the court had. Now, they made very clear that they weren't ruling on Brexit. They were ruling on the prorogation. So I think it probably is unfair for anybody to say that they are determined to stop Brexit. Now, you can accuse Gina Miller of wanting to do that, and I think that is a legitimate cause for debate, where, again, Gina Miller, who has been elected by nobody, can use her money to do this. Now, the courts have decided in her favour, so we have to respect that. But John Major was part of this as well. We just heard from the Counsel General of Wales. There are all sorts of different parties to this. And you can say, well, they've all got one thing in common. They want to stop Britain leaving the EU. Well, Boris Johnson, it seems, played into their hands. Now, I don't know what the consequences of this are going to be, politically or indeed constitutionally. But let's talk to somebody who probably has a much better idea, certainly on the constitutional point, than I do. Dr. David Starkey, constitutional historian and broadcaster, a good friend of the programme. David, very good evening.
Good evening, Ian.
Now, I suspect you're going to think I'm being far too amenable to what the Supreme Court did today. But
no, I think you're being measured, and I think you're being sensible. But I think equally we've got to remember two things. The Supreme Court is a very new body. It is invented by the Blair government, and it would appear to be a kind of, and I'm going to choose these words carefully, an alien graft on our Constitution. It is, in those terrible words of the late Prime Minister, it is an anywhere court, not a somewhere court.
What does that mean?
It means I do not think that what it decided corresponds to the existing state of English law. Can I elaborate
Sure.
that? Because I think it's really very important. You have not mentioned that only a few days ago, the three most senior judges in England, that's to say the Chief Justice, the Lord Chief Justice, the Master of the Rolls, and the President of the Chancery Division, all sitting as the High Court, ruled without any doubt that the case that was brought by Gina Miller was not justiciable. In other words, that the law had no regard over a prorogation. Now, in making that verdict, they have 300 years of precedent on their side. If you examine the judgment of the Supreme Court, you began quite correctly by saying, what law did he break? There is not a single relevant precedent cited. English law goes by precedent. They do cite a precedent. The precedent, you've asked me to be a constitutional historian, the precedent of the case of proclamations of 1611. They cite it because they've lifted it straight from a law dictionary. They don't understand its context. What that case said was indeed that the prerogative cannot invent, listen to it, a crime. It cannot, as it were, impose a criminal penalty on the subject. We are not dealing with this rule, with this use of the prerogative. We are dealing, on the contrary, in the use of the prerogative within Parliament to manage Parliament.
But they're not trying to impose a criminal sanction on Boris Johnson, are they?
No, you're misunderstanding. So you're not listening carefully.
I apologise.
The only precedent, you clearly haven't read the judgment, the only precedent that is cited is the 1611 judgment, which said the prerogative could not create a new offence at law and therefore was limited. But that's only talking about the role of the prerogative in terms of criminal law. In other words, that a royal proclamation can't invent a crime. It has absolutely nothing to do with the use of the prerogative over foreign policy, the use of the prerogative to prorogue Parliament, the use of the prerogative to dissolve Parliament. And in other words, they are inventing completely new law. That is why there is the contradiction between their verdict and the verdict of not only the High Court in England, but the court in Belfast and the first judgment in Scotland. And again, if you look at the judgment of the Inner House of the Court of Sessions in Scotland, it again employs completely abstract principles. It does not cite law, it does not cite specific statute, it does not cite any form of precedent at all. This is dangerous.
Now, I'm not a great expert in listening to the judgments of the Supreme Court, but I obviously listened intently to what Baroness Hale was saying this morning. And the language that she was deploying in her findings, I would have thought was slightly untypical of the Supreme Court.
I agree.
I felt that it... Even though I don't dispute the decision, I felt that it verged on the political in some ways.
So you've used the right word. And not only did the language of the judgment verge on the political, in fact, it wasn't verging, it was political. It is not for judges to rule on political, as it were, truthfulness. You know, you began by making that point. We've already had a case thrown out that tried to, as it were, reverse the result of the referendum or whatever it was on the grounds that the claims of the Leavers, you know, the 350 million a week for the NHS were wrong. And the judges then said sensibly, sorry, political tactics are political tactics, right? It's not for the law to intervene on them. Similarly, if you actually listen to some of the interventions in the Supreme Court, particularly one of the Scottish Council, it was bizarre. It wasn't a legal speech. It was a speech at the hustings. It was, you know, stand up for rights, stand up for justice, stand up for diversity. And he wasn't shot down. So do you see what I mean? This is not how we do law in England.
No, you're right, but on the other hand, the government didn't really enter a defence, did they?
Government, I do not know what has happened to the government's legal advice. The government also, and again, Jonathan Sumption was very interesting on this, although he is, you know, a passionate Remainer, and he said that like me, that there is absolutely no grounds for declaring that the rightness or wrongness of a political decision, that is a prorogation, can be judged at law. But then he said, wasn't it stupid of the government to lie so evidently about it, and that therefore, as a kind of revenge, the judges might slap them down? And I think that's right. I think the government was completely stupid to give a transparently false reason. I think Johnson, you know, has got much too much of a record of loose language, to put it as mildly as possible, and this just reinforces it. But it does, you know, the fact the judges thought, OK, we'll slap them down, that's not a judicial behaviour. That's doing something of profound... This, Ian, let's really understand this. This changes the way we are governed. This changes the way we do politics. This changes the way in which we've thought of ourselves. I mean, you began talking about the English Constitution and the fact that it was held up for admiration. The events not simply of today or of the last 3 weeks, but the events since the referendum have broken the which is really the English Constitution. They have broken it. It lies shattered in pieces like a noble statue that has been pushed over and deliberately broken. And it is an act of utter vandalism. And once it's broken, I don't think it can be put back together again. You asked, again, where we go. The answer is nobody knows. We are in territory that we have not lost. The last time we were in territory like this, it was settled by war, civil war.
Why did the Blair government abolish the law lords and create a Supreme Court? Because that's at the root of this, isn't it?
It is the absolute root of this. Because they were operating, and the other things they did, of course, they deliberately suppressed the office of Lord Chancellor and so on. They were operating according to, I think, you again, and you were really, I was very impressed with your introduction, but I think, despite its wonderful level-headedness, it was fundamentally wrong. I don't think there's a conspiracy. I don't think that it's behind closed doors. I think I would call it something differently, and it also begins with a C. I would call it a campaign. What we're seeing now is the culmination of a campaign that began with Charter 88. The principle of Charter 88 was to introduce two things that were totally alien to the way we were governed in England. One was that it was effectively cited by the junior judge in the Court of Sessions in Scotland, that every decision of government is subject to judicial review.
Which is what happens in America, obviously.
Effectively, every decision. Now think what that means. Think in particular for Mr. Corbyn what it means. Can you try imagining getting a left-wing agenda through every single thing that he and MacDonald want to do is going to go to the courts? And
they might be careful what they wish for, I suppose.
They might be very careful what they wish for. So, but let's just go back to Charter 88. It is the determination to make sure that every act of government can be reviewed. Now, this means government is impossible. You made the case with Gina Miller. Nobody goes to court to say, oh, there is a problem about procedure, if they agree with the decision, do they? The only time you go to court to question procedure is because you disagree with the substance of the decision. So although the courts claim they're not being political and are not intervening in the political process, objectively, actually, they are. Right. That's point one of Charter 88. The other point of Charter 88, it sought to introduce what's called the separation of powers. This is a weird French theory, most weird theories of French, of the 18th century, a man called Montesquieu. And it argues that the legislative, the lawmaking capacity of government, and the executive, that's government as we normally call it, and the judiciary are three separate powers, and they must be completely separated from each other. Now, this is pretty true about law. Though, as we've seen today, law is now trespassing on the field of government. But the real problem with the application of that to England was, of course, there has never been a separation of powers between the executive and Parliament. We have an executive that sits in Parliament, doesn't it?
Yes,
all
indeed.
Members of the Cabinet are members of the Commons or the Lords. And also, again, as we've seen over the past few years, if you do not have a government with a majority, and again, the catastrophe of the fixed-term Parliament had, if you don't have a government with a majority, if you don't have a government that is prepared and able to whip its MPs, and if you don't have control of the agenda of the House of Commons, what does the House of Commons turn into? A talking shop. It turns into something that dissolves, that obstructs any form of action, that in the case of Brexit can agree on what it doesn't want, but can't agree on what it wants. And moreover, the idea that 600 and odd people can conduct a negotiation with Monsieur Barnier is frankly demented.
Now,
and And to get to that position, as I said, is because we've introduced this false concept of the separation of powers. And it was also there in the judgment of the Supreme Court. It talked about the Parliament's scrutiny of the government, of the executive. It talked about the urgent need for democratic accountability. This is a Parliament which has deliberately refused to go to the people. We heard again from Corbyn, we will not allow there to be a general election. So the argument of democratic accountability cannot possibly be applied. You see what I mean?
I do. We have to finish in a second, but we've just heard that Boris Johnson has now spoken to the Queen. Would you like to speculate on what he might have said and what her reaction would have been?
I think he probably said, "Oh, cripes," didn't he?
Or words to that effect, yes.
And I think she probably gave him a Windsor look. There was no dry sherry.
No, quite. Now, David, you and I talked for an hour at the Edinburgh Fringe. The podcast of that conversation will be released tomorrow on the Ian Dale All Talk podcast. So if any of our listeners haven't had enough of you over the last 90 minutes, they can have an hour of you on the podcast from tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Dr. David Starkey, constitutional historian and broadcaster.